It's probably no surprise to anyone that the earliest schools in the land that would one day become the United States of America were infused with Christian beliefs, morals, and instruction. What may come as a surprise is that the establishment of these public schools occurred under Massachusetts legislation through a 1647 Education Act dramatically titled the Old Deluder Satan Act. According to the Elizabeth Murray Project, a resource site for early American history, this act required that towns with more than 50 householders were required to appoint someone to teach children to read and write. In communities with more than 100 families or householders, grammar schools were required. By setting out grammar schools, the legislators attempted to ensure that children acquired the basic literacy skills that would enable them to gain knowledge of the scriptures and thereby confound the devil. The introduction to the act reads, "It being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures, as in former times, by keeping them in an unknown tongue, so in these latter times by persuading from the use of tongues, that so that at least the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded and corrupted with false glosses of saint-seeming deceivers, and to the end that learning may not be buried in the grave of our forefathers, in church and commonwealth, the Lord assisting our endeavors." In a New York Times article from October 2021 titled "Christian Schools Boom in a Revolt Against Curriculum and Pandemic Rules," tells us, in the 2019 and 2020 school year, 3.5 million of the 54 million American school children attended religious schools, including almost 600,000 in conservative Christian schools, at least according to the latest account by the Education Department. As someone who received the vast majority of their education in private Christian schools, I feel like I have a lot to say on this topic. The only years I ever spent in public school were first and second grade. In the years that followed, I was sent to a variety of tiny fundamentalist Christian schools where our academic instruction was laced with indoctrination. I had little to no choice over who my friends were or what my social circle would be. And everything worked to ensure that I had no access to anyone, adult or child, who thought differently than the small bubble I was being raised in. The reality of the lack of oversight, the inherent racism and homophobia within the structure of the schools, and the lower standards in curriculum all show that private Christian schools can be breeding grounds for abuse, neglect, and subpar education. And we'll be tackling all these ideas through the lens of my own experience today on Morning Thoughts. Hi, I'm Andi, and my pronouns are they, them. Welcome to Season 2 of Morning Thoughts, an Assigned Christian at Birth podcast created to share with you what I've been learning lately about evangelical fundamentalism. Most of what I talk about here is not the kind of stuff you're going to find in Bible study or at church. You might not even believe the things I'm saying, and that's fine. The whole point of my channel is to encourage you to go research things for yourself and see if they match up or not to what you've been taught. Thank you so much for being here. Season 2 of Morning Thoughts debuts today. Welcome, welcome. If you could do me a favor and smash that like button for me really quick, I would greatly appreciate that. Now, let's get into it. So my parents got divorced during the summer between 8th and 9th grade, but when I tell you that's like the least traumatic thing that's ever happened to me in my life, please believe me. Once in my early 20s, I was seeing a Christian counselor who could not get it through her head that I never felt any responsibility or guilt over my parents' divorce, and that I never once thought I was the reason for it. Like, I understand it's very common for kids to think that, but I never did, and she would not believe me about this. Honestly, the whole thing made a lot of sense to me at the time, and that's because my best friend from church had just gone through her parents getting divorced literally the summer before. Once her parents were divorced, I knew it was only a matter of time for mine because in my eyes, her family was the perfect Christian family. I went on church-sponsored mission trips with them, more often than not spent Sunday afternoons at their house between morning church and night church. And at one point, I was even taken to an anti-abortion rally with them. And that's where I was first exposed to the graphic type of photos you see on posters at those events. When they got divorced, her mom took her and her sister to a different church. And similarly, when my parents got divorced, my mom took my brother and I to a new church. You might be asking, what does all this have to do with Christian school? Well, let me tell you. This church was closer in proximity to my Calvinist/Reformed Christian high school, which meant that I was now attending a church where some kids from my school went. That's not an experience I had ever had before. I enjoyed being at church with my new friends, but when we went back to school in the fall, I was the only freshman. Everyone else was either a sophomore or a junior, so no one else from church experienced the freshman year Bible class that I had. I did meet my best friend that year, and we both suffered through that class and have since commiserated about it together many times. It wasn't just that it was the guy's first year teaching, or that he had zero respect from the students. It was that he clearly had no common sense on what was appropriate in a classroom. From calling on a popular football player to come lay on a table at the front of the room to act out the story of Isaac being sacrificed by Abraham, and then pulling out a huge butcher knife from behind the podium and advancing toward him, to saying, "Now imagine me naked," while acting out the story of Noah being drunk post-flood. He made a lot of bad choices that year. Aside from those incidents, one of the main things I remember that has always stuck with me about that class is that the first question on the first test of the year was a fill in the blank, homosexuality is, and the answer was wickedness. I remember thinking to myself as I wrote the word down that I wasn't entirely convinced that it was wicked to love another person, but over the remaining years at that school, that feeling was driven out by the casual, rampant homophobia that snaked its way into the daily lives of high school students everywhere in the late 90s and early 2000s, let alone a fundamentalist Christian school. "That's gay" was such a common response to something you didn't like, and no one thought twice about it. I was in school musicals, and there was a lot of haha gay about some of the guys who were in them with us, and it was clear that being gay was not something that would ever be tolerated by my community. And by the time I had my first sex dream a couple of years later about one of the cheerleaders from school, the only response I had was to wake up in horror, wondering why I had such a terrible nightmare. Throughout my entire education in fundamentalist Christian schools, I never had a single sex ed class. During my freshman biology class, I remember we learned about spider reproduction and that the scientific drawings of human anatomy were completely taped over with black tape in our bio textbooks. Aside from the indoctrination and the brainwashing, I think my biggest gripe with my childhood and adolescent education is the fact that I didn't have the opportunity to truly learn. Critical thinking was discouraged. Memorizing facts for each test and then forgetting them was the norm for me and everyone I knew. Our AP literature classes involved reading one novel a semester, along with our, other work for the class. But imagine my surprise when I got to college and compared AP experiences with other people who went to public school all over the country and found out that they had an entire reading list of novels to go through each semester. Imagine my surprise during my freshman year of high school when I couldn't see the whiteboard very well and convinced my mom to take me to an eye doctor, where the optometrist confirmed that, yes, I definitely needed glasses. I wonder how much earlier I would have gotten them if I went to public school where eye tests on campus were a thing. I remember that happening each year during first and second grade. Imagine my surprise when I discovered my freshman year of college in Intro to Psych, at a Bible college even, I found out that there was a math disability called dyscalculia, the symptoms of which completely described me and my high school experience with math to a T. It finally explained why I failed at worst and barely passed at best every single one of my high school math classes. The private Christian schools of my childhood and adolescence failed me in so many ways. They not only stunted my education and my ability to think critically, but also my ability to understand and embrace myself for who I am as a person. They kept me in a homogenized environment where I would have no chance to encounter different beliefs, ideas, or ways of life. The schools I attended had very few students of color and about as many Black students as I can count on one hand. It wasn't until college that I had the experience of being taught by a Black teacher. By the time I got to the latter half of high school, I was regularly begging to be homeschooled due to the fact that I had no friends left at the school since my older friends graduated, and my best friend was on a different lunch schedule than me. More often than not, I ended up alone in the attic of the art room, eating my lunch every day, poring over the collection of the school's yearbooks that went back decades. The small amount of students gave me no opportunity to select what kind of people I wanted to be friends with. It was either be friends with these people or have no friends. I was bullied a decent amount, which I always thought made absolutely no sense since we were supposed to be Christians. We all had to write and sign a statement of faith every year to be readmitted to the school. I might not have enjoyed being at church 3 to 4 times a week and in Christian school every day, but I was at least faking it well in order to not get in trouble. And I didn't understand why everyone else wasn't at least doing that too. By the time I graduated, I was extremely insecure, had very low self-esteem, had no idea who I was, and was completely academically and socially unprepared for life after high school. I was taught during my senior year Bible class that you should never marry someone whose parents are divorced. Shell-shocked, I went to church that Wednesday night and talked to my closest two friends there, one girl, one boy, and both of them immediately replied that, yeah, of course, they would never marry somebody whose parents were divorced. Did they even think about my home situation when they answered? No. They were just repeating their own indoctrination. But it broke my fucking heart at the time. I was destroyed. In that moment, never having been in a relationship at 17 years old, I was certain it was going to remain that way forever. At school, I felt so isolated and lonely that I can't even imagine what the experience was for the students of color. Speaking of students of color, while Christian beliefs have been inherent in the education of United States students since before we even became a country, and the formulation of private Christian schools became more common as the public schools became more secular in the early 20th century, the establishment of private schools exploded during the integration years of the 1960s as more white Christian parents wanted to keep their kids from being exposed to their black counterparts. In his book, The Bible Told Them So, J. Russell Hawkins details the rise of Christian segregation academies in South Carolina, the last state to integrate their public schools. These schools weren't a brand new thing, though, when integration was happening. Russell writes that in South Carolina, the idea of utilizing private schools to avoid public school desegregation actually predated the 1954 Brown decision, when state leaders, perhaps acting as prognosticators regarding school integration, proposed measures to accommodate private education should the integration mandate come to pass. In the spring of 1958, former president of the University of South Carolina and current candidate for governor Donald S. Russell was dedicated to maintaining school segregation in his state, even if the government was insisting on integration. His plan was to take the money the state allocated per pupil in the public schools and give it directly to each family instead so that they could decide what type of education was best for their children. The proposal said that the state and the school district involved would provide the student with his tuition to attend a school, private or otherwise, of his choice in a reasonable radius of his home, but that the student himself would select voluntarily the school that he would attend, and that school would not be under control of the state. The plan did not come to pass at that time, but would years later after South Carolina was actually forced to integrate. Hawkins writes that preserving segregated public education longer than any other state in the Union, South Carolina strictly enforced the color line until January 1963. My mom was born in 1961. My dad was born in 1958. Like, the fact that the births of my parents are so close to a time where segregation was still happening, it continues to blow my mind every day. Hawkins goes on to say that as long as desegregation was merely talked about rather than enacted, the need for public school alternatives remained at bay. Despite occasional calls for private schools throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was not until 1963 that the South Carolina legislature revisited the question of how best to support private schools as substitutes for the desegregated public versions. Eventually, in keeping with historical precedent, the rate at which private schools in South Carolina were established was directly related to the amount of forced integration that was happening in the state. Hawkins tells us that between 1964 and 1972, when the majority of school desegregation in South Carolina occurred, white South Carolinians formed 111 new private schools. By 1973, these schools that had been established enrolled 25,000 white students. This trajectory continued through the early 70s, and by the mid-70s, South Carolina had enrolled a higher percentage of students in private schools than in any other Southern state. In 1974, a full 20 years after the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, it was estimated that over 3,000 private schools had been established in Southern states whose roots could be found in the desegregation of public schools. Let's read a couple quotes from Hawkins' book that further explain this movement. The headmaster of one of the Southern private academies was quoted as saying, "Religion is an integral part of the private school movement because it's an integral part of the South. Our people, the supporters of the independent schools, are convinced that God is behind us. That I am sure of, that we are doing God's work. If you don't include the religious aspect, you're missing a good part of the motivation behind this movement. People full-heartedly believe that God does not want us to mix." Next quote. The theology of segregation that evangelicals once employed to thwart racial mixing was recalibrated to endorse a biblically inspired defense of the family. The God who had demanded racial integrity now became the God who required familial protection, with the result being exactly the same. White Christians avoided contact with Black people, and segregation remained in practice, if not in pronouncements. Denying that race was the cause for enrolling children in private schools did not make it so, but it did begin the process of allowing Southern white Christians to elide the connection between their school choices and race. A researcher who attended a convention in the early 1970s for private school students noted this lack of awareness in the students themselves. Every student at the convention said that they were attending private school because their parents did not want them in integrated schools, but none of the students described this decision as race-based. A student comment captured the vibe of the times perfectly when they said, "Slurs are dumb, can't learn, and when you have a majority of low standard in a school, they will pull all the rest down. It's not really a race issue, just a matter of lowering standards." The New York Times article I referenced earlier says that about 68% of students at conservative Christian private schools are white, according to the Education Department, a figure that is comparable to other categories of private schools, but significantly higher than public schools. Later in the article, the author writes, if many conservative Protestant schools in the 1960s and 70s were founded to keep white children away from certain people, then the goal today is keeping children away from certain ideas, said J. Russell Hawkins, a professor of humanities and history at Indiana Wesleyan University. But the ideas being avoided are still having to do with race. In a 2021 article for Open Democracy, Chrissy Stroop writes, all U.S. Christian schools are mainly privately funded through tuition and donations, but many also take state funding via voucher programs that, under the banner of school choice, allow parents to use the tax money that would go towards their children's education in public schools for private schools instead. Christian colleges, many that have been granted federal waivers, allowing them to discriminate against LGBTQIA people, also have access to considerable federal funding. A Huffington Post investigation in 2017 found that many voucher-funded Christian schools seriously distort history through their use of curricula published by Abeka, BJU Press, and Accelerated Christian Education. A follow-up article this year revealed how these commonly used Christian textbooks exhibit the same rhetorical strategies as the Trump administration, sending a religion-centered, anti-democrat, anti-science, anti-multicultural message. As we creep closer to the presidential election this November, it's imperative that Trump be kept from a second term if we're ever going to make progress in changing these hallmarks of Christian conservative schooling. Every kid in this country deserves an education backed by standards in an environment that encourages, not hampers, their personal, social, and academic development. I'm not saying that Biden is the best. You will never catch me saying that. I have a lot of feelings about him, but that's neither here nor there right now. I'm also not saying that public school is the best option either. We know it's not. Just look how the students of our country rank against students elsewhere in the world. It's not pretty, especially in these post-2019 years. But the fact remains, these conservative Christian schools are pipelines into conservative Christian colleges that promote conservative Christian nationalism and other ideas that set our country back hundreds of years. This is going to be a monumental year for the United States as a democracy, as an empire, and as a country. Let's all do what we can to ensure we don't go any further backwards. Get out and vote. Get your friends and family registered to vote. Whether racist parents were keeping their white children away from kids of color or are currently keeping their children away from those with different life experiences and perspectives, homogeneity in one's education only serves to harm the student. I am living proof. As Chrissy Stroop said at the end of her article, what's even more unfortunate is that the U.S. seems incapable of having a serious conversation about how to balance the rights of children and members of marginalized groups with proper religious freedom, which entails equal accommodation for adherents of all religions as well as the non-religious. Ceasing to fund Christian nationalist indoctrination with tax dollars seems like an obvious place to start. But until a critical mass of the public cares enough about the issue to push back on the Christian right, nothing will change. Musical transition. And now we come to the part of the podcast where I talk about what I've been reading lately. I've actually been doing a lot of reading, so I picked a couple to highlight. I read a book called The Jesus Cult by Robert Connor. I really enjoyed this book because I'm a total nerd, and it details how through the thousands of years of Christianity, the belief in Jesus's imminent arrival and return on the clouds has always been a core tenet of the religion. Every generation of Christians has believed that he's about to come right back. It also investigates the ongoing damage of this belief system and covers the incoherence and lack of unity in the resurrection narratives. Stay tuned for Easter this year, because if you like deconstructing Christmas, there's going to be deconstructing Easter as well. What else? I finally read Educated by Tara Westover. I know that book has been really big over the last couple years, and I really enjoyed it. I love memoirs the way I love documentaries. I love learning about the lives of other people. This one is about someone who was raised fundamentalist Mormon, denied an education, abused, but managed to get herself to Cambridge in England for a PhD. I've read a lot about fundamentalist Mormonism, but typically within the context of FLDS cults like Jeff's or LeBaron. But this family lived off grid and mostly kept to themselves, so it was definitely a different type of fundamentalist Mormon story. If you like memoirs, I highly encourage you to pick this one up. Last but not least, it's no secret that I'm a Disney adult. I mean, you can see all my Oogie Boogies back there. I've been meaning to read Kingdom Keepers for years, ever since I was the manager of the young adult department at Borders like 15 years ago. This is a story about AI and involves the idea of Disney animatronics coming to life at night after the park is closed. If you're a Disney parks enthusiast at all, you should totally read this. I don't know that I'm going to read the entire series because it's written for like late elementary aged kids, but it was really fun. And if I had a kid, I would definitely be reading these to them. Thank you so much for being here with me today. If you'd like to support my work, check out buymeacoffee.com/assignedxtian, where you can send one-time or monthly donations. If you join a monthly plan, there are all kinds of different perks, one of which you'll see here at the end of the video. I have 2 members of the ACAB fam who've joined a tier that gives them a producer credit on this podcast. So join me here next Sunday for the next episode of Assigned Christian at Birth, where I'm going to talk about what it was like growing up, not knowing I was gay, figuring out I was gay, and deconstructing that whole thing. So yeah, have a wonderful week, everyone. Okay, bye.